Dear Howard James, I'm so glad to meet you and so honored to have such a great opportunity to interview with you. And also, thank you for writing such an excellent book as Seven Crashed. This book now was translated into Mandarin editions, and it's very bestseller in Chinese market. And what you mentioned, the crash, in my opinion, as I mentioned right now, does indeed described the impact of the major events that the world has experienced over the past century. So now we all know that the world is also facing new challenges. And in the past months, I have visited five countries to participate in international forums, and almost all scholars and experts worldwide are discussing the new impact that Trump 2.0 will bring.
Yes.
So I don't know if I can describe it as a new crash, as your book said. So, but the first question I want to ask you is that what impact do you think Trump 2.0 will have on the world? What are the similarities and the differences with Trump 1.0?
I think indeed it's a very interesting question. I think you can already see some of the impact before the transition, before the inauguration. But you've already seen the German government collapsed on the day that the US election results became known. And the Canadian government is just on the point of collapse. So it's brought an enormous amount of turbulence, I think, at first among the allies of the United States. Canada obviously has a complex relationship with the United States, but it's a key part of the North Atlantic alliance, and Germany was also really the key element in Europe. And people are wondering now, can you rely on the United States? When you think of policy that's directed at America first, it looks as if the old pattern of friends and allies on the one hand and rivals or threats on the other hand is just being completely mixed up. Um, we don't obviously know which direction this is going to go in, and I think like every political movement, the Trump movement has a kind of coalition. It's a coalition on the one hand of people who have felt left behind by globalization or vulnerable, who've lost jobs, who've been the employed formerly in industries that were exporting to the world, and now they're threatened by foreign competition. And so a lot of that pool blames China and blames in particular the Chinese accession to the WTO in 2001. It's a rather indiscriminate kind of lumping together of all sorts of effects, because this is not just an effect of globalization, but it's also an effect of technical change. And one of the things that's been happening over the last 10 or 15 years is that many sorts of production have actually been coming back to the United States and to other industrial countries, but not creating very many jobs, in that they're mostly done by robots. And so the technology is leading to job losses as well. But anyway, on the one hand, there's this coalition of people who think that globalization is an enemy. On the other hand, and it's become, I think, even more evident since the election. It was a little bit before, but since the election, it's much, much clearer that a lot of the most dynamic businesses in the United States are looking to Trump to give them a particular advantage. And those are mostly businesses that are very globally oriented. So Elon Musk, who now appears constantly side by side with Donald Trump, um, is somebody who has interests, obviously, with satellites that span the world, very, very heavy interests in Asia. And, some of the things that are now being seen. On the one hand, there's the internationally oriented tech elite. And what they're really promising is a technical transformation that is going to, they think at least, improve people's lives. I'm quite optimistic about some of that, um, but it's going to be a difficult fit, and I think you will see the elements of this precarious coalition or precarious alliance struggle as they face realities. And another aspect of it, I think, is the foreign policy that Trump, I believe, made a considerable success of claiming that he would end the wars that are either involving the United States or occurring elsewhere, and that he has a kind of muscle that President Biden didn't have, and so he could put pressure on Netanyahu in Israel or President Putin in Russia to solve the problems in Gaza or Ukraine. But that requires a considerable amount of optimism, I think, to believe that those problems are very, very easily soluble.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that really it looks like that Trump new term bring a lot of international change. But on the other hand, in my opinion, the impact of Trump 2.0 may not exceed that of Trump 1.0. Because my reason oriented from the changes in the world over the past 8 years. Because in the past 8 years, the global south, as well as the other emerging economy, has risen collectively. And the world is no longer dominated by the United States. And the United States remains the most powerful country, of course. But the problem is U.S. influence has declined in the world. And some countries have taken radical measures to confront the United States, such as Russia. Why I mention Russia? Because in the past 2 years, I have visited Russia 9 times
Yes.
and investigated over 20 cities and written over 30 articles about Russia and Russia-Ukraine conflict. And also, I raised sharp questions to President Putin twice in person.
Yes.
And because I'm not pro-Russia scholar, but I do see Russia's resilience and strategic determination to confront the United States. And so my question is, such a confrontational strategy of Russia may not end by Trump, because as we all know, Trump said in the past that Russia-Ukraine conflict will be resolved within one day.
Yes.
But I really don't think so. In fact, I believe that the Russia-Ukraine conflict will be a long term and will bring a greater international impact or crash in the future. So my second question to you, Professor James, what according to your logic, is it the AIDS crash? So how do you evaluate the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict in the past 3 years as well as in the future?
Well, as you say, I think this is part of an era of turbulence, era of chaos, of uncertainty, and to my mind, in many ways, it goes back to 2020 and the outbreak of the pandemic. I think the pandemic had a major impact, and we're still living with many aspects of the legacy of that pandemic. But one of the things that the pandemic showed up very, very clearly was the importance of supply chains and how supply chains can easily be disrupted. And so for a country that is sitting on a powerful resource like energy, in the case of Russia, um, there's an immediate temptation to think that that control of energy supplies can be used as a political leverage and to push the Europeans, for instance, and many countries, most spectacularly Germany, were highly, highly dependent on Russian gas and Russian oil. So they could be pushed was the argument. Because suddenly in the pandemic we discovered shortages that we didn't really even know were strategically important. So for instance, I don't think anybody really spent a great deal of time thinking about the production of semiconductors, and semiconductors require for their manufacture neon gas. Neon gas, it turns out, was a product of a unique steelmaking process that was used in Russia and Ukraine. And so Russia and Ukraine were the major sources of this neon gas. And so immediately after the Russian attack, you get problems in manufacturing semiconductors. And then this was a moment that we also wanted more semiconductors because we're changing things, we're adopting new technology, and so on. So, it does seem to me that this is really part of the story of instrumentalizing, or some people talk about weaponizing supply chains. And you see more and more countries doing that. It's not just Russia. Algeria has done this in terms of its gas supplies to Spain, because Spain was exporting gas to Morocco, but Morocco is locked in a territorial conflict in the Western Sahara. So Algeria was trying to use its control of gas to put pressure on Morocco. You will find, I think every side doing this more and more, and particularly very big countries, the United States and China, can both play this game very successfully.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a very important uh, key word, that is weaponization.
Yeah,
Not only such a supply chain now has been weaponized, and also a lot of technology and tools has been weaponized. So weaponization include, for example, the currency,
yeah,
the high tech, AI, uh, dollar,
yeah.
uh, as well as the as a lot of things can be weaponized. So my next question is about if United States continue to push such a weaponization of everything. So is it a new crash for the globalization as well as the soft power of United States? How do you think about it?
Well, I think you've raised this question in a very interesting way. Um, that the moments in which there are big technical changes and big awarenesses of supply chain problems are also moments at which there's increased tension between the major powers. So historically, there are some really good precedents for this, and I think if you think about my account in Seven Crashes, it starts with the middle of the 19th century and a very severe negative supply shock for European countries, Northern European countries. Um, Immediately, it becomes clear that Europe can't feed itself; it needs grain from somewhere else. And one of the most obvious places, apart from North America, was the Russian Empire. And so the big, very fertile black earth areas at the south of the Russian Empire, partly in what's now Ukraine, partly what's now the Russian Federation, were becoming big grain exporters. And in the 1850s, there was a very, very major conflict between Britain and France on the one side and Russia on the other side about the Crimea. So, exactly the area that's at the center of the contestation since 2014, and still, I think, part of the issue at stake between Russia and Ukraine. That was the subject of a conflict in the middle of the 19th century, as Russia wanted to extend its control southwards and thought that the declining Ottoman Empire was a place where it could expand its influence. So, the story of using control and trying to weaponize supplies, and I think also with the currency, that's another part of that story, is very, very characteristic of these moments when globalization is shifting or when globalization is changing direction. I mean, I think it's worth thinking a little bit more about the currency as well, um, because that's clearly one of the elements that's at stake in the new transition. And Donald Trump has said very many things about strengthening the US dollar at the center of the international system, and he clearly sees the US dollar as part of American strength. But on the other hand, um, what the effect of the tariff policies and the restriction of migration and the repatriation of undocumented aliens and a big fiscal stimulus, the tax cuts, will be almost certainly is a push in an inflationary direction. And so there'll be an element of instability in the US currency. So some people think that the combination of the tariffs and the increased fiscal expenditure is going to push the Federal Reserve to tighten up, and so we'll get something like a repeat of the 1980s. And in the early 1980s, there was exactly that constellation with very, very loose fiscal policies. Ronald Reagan was ramping up defense expenditure, and at the same time, a Federal Reserve that was worried about inflation and pushed up the interest rates and then created a debt crisis. So there's that fear of new instability arising from the odd policy mix in the United States. It's difficult to tell how much of this will really be implemented. Some people will say that the proposed tariffs or the suggested tariffs are simply a bargaining instrument, and that the idea is that there will be some kind of strategic bargain, as there was in the 1980s when the United States was in a similar position. Then it was mostly confronting Japan, and people were afraid of the surge of Japanese imports into the United States. Japan seemed to be doing everything right. It had better automobile technology. And then the United States threatened really that unless the Japanese changed their policy, they would be subject to very, very harsh tariff penalties. And Japan changed the policies. It did too much inflation. It effectively destroyed the Japanese economy by the 1990s. And I think many people in your country look at that Japanese experience and think we don't want to be treated like that again, and we don't want to have a repetition of that experience where Japan was pushed by the United States into a set of policies that were, in the end, inappropriate and led to the collapse of the bubble economy, the so-called collapse of the bubble economy in the early 1990s.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think about the international bargaining not only between Japan and the United States. In my views, in the coming 4 years, there are a lot of international bargaining because, as we know, that Donald Trump believes that the other countries have made the United States pay more costs, especially in the NATO. He even said that allies, especially those NATO member states, must pay their own bill, and only
Yeah.
as member states treat us fairly, he would absolutely consider the withdrawing the United States from the NATO.
Yes.
So my question is that not only I think you mentioned the relationship between Japan and the United States, but also the United States and the other NATO members. So my question is about because we totally understood that America, Donald Trump is logical because Donald Trump always talking about American first and a
Mm.
great America great again, make America great again. But how will Trump's American first strategy affect the development of globalization in the future? And can you predict the United States and the world 4 years later? I mean, if we are in 2028, what will the world look like?
Well, we're at the moment in a very peculiarly bifurcated world, in the sense that in the United States, there's a great deal of optimism, and you can see the stock market surging, and many people are confident that AI will be really transformative. By contrast, in Europe, and particularly in the two largest states that were the drivers of the process of European integration, there's a great deal of anxiety and the feeling that there's a political stalemate, almost insoluble political problems in France and Germany. Um, and then the story that you were thinking about, where there's pressure to spend more on defense, is coming into that. I mean, I think I should say that what Donald Trump is saying there is not at all unusual or unprecedented. Many, many American politicians since the 1960s have really been making that point that Europeans should pay more for their defense, and that this was really a point made, as I say, already in the 1960s, when Germany was rising spectacularly and Japan was rising spectacularly. So the former enemies of the Second World War were doing very well, but the United States was defending them. And it's been a non-stop theme ever since then. I think, this is a moment of transition, and it's likely that Europe will do more to coordinate its own defense. It will pay more for defense, and it will take these statements from American politicians more seriously than it has done in the past. And that probably is a good thing, both for the United States and for Europe.
Yeah, but I still uh, I'm wondering whether or how do you think the coming 4 years crash?
Yeah.
So, yeah, especially in 2024. I mean, can you predict the coming change in the 4 years
Well,
for in the world?
I mean, the biggest change to me seems to be not to do with Donald Trump or with any particular politician, but to do with the amazing
Mm.
pace of technical transformation at the moment. That we've got a rate of technical transformation that is really unprecedented in history, and the countries that realize the opportunities that that technical transformation gives them will be in a very powerful position. At the moment, many people think that since a lot of this innovation is driven by the United States, that the United States may be the major beneficiary of it. But it seems to me that a lot of the story of the AI revolution will depend on particular applications, and those applications will be made all over the world by people in China, by people in Japan, in East Asia, but also by people in Europe. There's a lot of biotechnology. I think biotechnology, pharmaceutical innovation is going to be one of the major areas that will benefit because already AI is identifying many potential pharmacological uses. So new drugs, new patents, new ways of combating disease, and that's really where we're going to see the transformation. And so, if you ask me, can I make a prediction about what's happening in 4 or 8 years? It seems to me, on the whole, that the
mm,
world will be a more interconnected place, that the technology will be transformative, and that, as in previous eras, we will see technology jumping very quickly across national frontiers, and that even with the all the discussion about high fences and small yards, the language that we use to discuss the uh, trying to keep technology to ourselves, um, that's not likely to be successful. Technology is developing everywhere, and it will be an interplay of that development. And that's probably good in the sense that, after all,
mm,
in the world we have common challenges. We have challenges of disease, the
mm,
challenge of aging populations. So, every continent except for Africa is aging very quickly.
mm,
We need to find an answer to that. Um, how to look after elderly people is going to be more and more of a concern. Um, how to educate young people. Uh, this is one of the areas where AI applications are again really helpful. And this has been a source of problems in the aftermath of the pandemic. Many people young people in the United States and elsewhere, but I think particularly badly in the United States and Europe, had
mm,
their education disrupted, and they're at risk of losing out, and they need to be trained. Um, you need new methods in order to train them, and
mm,
new advances in education are going to give the answer there. So, in the end, actually, I do see something where there's likely to be more technical change, more international connection, uh, maybe less in the way of trade in goods, though. That may be one area where uh,
mm,
the the tendency is not rising so much. But I think there is an interesting
mm,
statistical effect there. If I might just add that one thought on, one of the things that people use to say that
mm,
we're deglobalizing, or we've been experiencing a period of slow globalization, is
mm,
that since the middle of the 2010s,
mm,
the share of world trade in world
mm,
output,
mm,
world GDP, has wobbled around but not risen
mm,
anymore, whereas before that it was rising very dramatically. But actually, if you measure instead the share of world trade as a share of world manufactured output,
mm.
then you see a continued rise. People are still trading, but it's just that we're manufacturing less and we're producing more in the way of services. And that's going to be, I think, intensely pushed by
Mm.
the AI revolution.
Yeah, I agree with you. Because in the coming 4 years or 8 years, Donald Trump is not a unique authority for the future changes of the world. And also, you mentioned that Trump's policy is small country yard and higher walls, and also you mentioned the deglobalization or slow globalization. I think it's a very sharp thinking. But I have to share with you is that from the Chinese Academy, we have another new terms about globalization, that is parallel globalization, uh,
Yes.
which means that because you mentioned the small country yard high wall of Donald Trump's policy, and this policy force the emerging economy or global south, especially China and India, as well as the other emerging economy. They push and promote the integration of the global South world. And on the other hand, that traditional globalization is still driven by the United States, mainly within the North Atlantic system. So, how do you think about the parallel globalization? Does it exist? And what will globalization look like in the future? I mean, except the slow globalization or deglobalization, is there any different new views about the globalization in the future?
Well, yes, I'm glad you brought that up because I think that that is indeed part of the process, and globalization is spreading more across the world, and it's also binding together countries that were previously largely excluded from the globalization process. Um, I'm not sure whether thinking about it in terms of the global South versus a traditional industrial world is quite the right way of thinking about it. I think of it more as opening up countries that had previously not really been connected very much with trade. Um, so let me think of a different kind of version of your story of parallel globalization,
Mm,
which is that the long history of globalization, if you go not just 100 years back, but thousands of years back, it's always been centered on cities that are on the coast, they're ports. So if you think of late medieval Europe, the drivers there were Venice and Genoa. And then the world shifts a bit to the North Sea and the Atlantic, and it becomes Antwerp and Amsterdam and London, and then New York and Shanghai and Hong Kong and Sydney and Buenos Aires, Rio. So port cities all over the world. And one of the things that I found fascinating about the Belt and Road Initiative was that you had the Sea Road, but also the belt across Asia. And when President Xi made that announcement, he made it in Kazakhstan, so an absolutely landlocked country. And
mm,
that's an example, I think, of the way in which the new globalization works, that
mm,
you can include countries like Kazakhstan in globalization, whereas previously, without
mm,
ports, they were just hopeless. But I think some of it is about physical transportation because there's a railroad linkage, obviously,
mm,
that puts Kazakhstan on a route that goes through either Russia or Ukraine
mm,
into Western Europe, and so there's a big terminal um, of the belt in the old Rhine port in Duisburg in Germany, where the Rhine meets the River Ruhr. Um, Here, you've got a more inclusive globalization, but I don't think it's simply a question of the North versus the South. I mean, one of the things that many people who've been analyzing the developments over the last 3 or 4 years have been pointing out is that um, there are more and more intermediary countries. And so Vietnamese trade with the United States is expanding enormously. Mexican
mm,
trade, exports to the United States is expanding. But Vietnam and Mexico are importing large amounts of goods from China. Um, India, big manufacturer of pharmaceuticals, generic pharmaceuticals, but many of the components for Indian pharmaceuticals come from China. So we still have complex supply chains. China is still a part of those supply chains, but it's that they're shifting in a slightly different way because of the way that tariffs were formulated. And this is the legacy.
mm,
Your very first question was about Trump one, and one of the things that Trump one did was to put up tariffs on China, and then the Biden administration carried those tariffs on. Um, So it's not surprising that trade is moving in new directions, and that, also I think you can see this with financial flows, that they're moving in more complicated ways now.
So actually, I think uh, right now we all mentioned a new question, that is the reshaping of the future world.
Yep.
So yeah, actually, I don't know whether you know, in academic community of China, there are two types of the viewpoints about the reshaping of the future world. One viewpoint, they think that United States is declining, the world order needs to be reshaped, and the international system need reform. And in this reform process, China can play a more important role, as you mentioned right now. But the other perspective holds such opinions that China is still a developing country, and China does not have such a power to promote the reform in the international system, and let alone replace the United States. It looks like that nowadays the latter force may be more prevalent in China, more popular in China. So I would like to ask you again, so let's focus on China, because right now you mentioned China many times. So what's the roles uh, in the future reshaping globalization? And is China also a form of crash, like you mentioned, the crash? So how do you think?
Yes. I think you can think of a world in which there are several countries that will shape globalization, and many people have been thinking about this. I mean, moving to what people call either multipolarity or a polycentric world. Polycentrism would also be, I think, a good term to describe that world. And in some ways, much of human history has been like this, in which there wasn't one clear dominant power. Even if you think 2,000 years ago, there was a powerful empire in the West, in the Roman Empire. There was a powerful Chinese empire. There was a pretty powerful Iranian empire. So there were several centers of where um, the political and economic geography of the world came together, and with big clashes at the edges and unstable borders. Um, if you think of early modern Europe, uh, several great powers, but also even in a microcosm in Italy, um, constantly feuding states between Venice and Milan and the papacy and Florence and Naples. Um, the period of unique domination by one power is pretty limited. I mean, I wouldn't think even in the 19th century that you could say that Britain ruled the world. I mean, it clearly didn't. There was a big French empire. The Germans were trying to build up an empire. Japan built itself up as a powerful rival. Russia was developing. And so, historically, there are many, many more episodes of this kind of polycentric story than there are of unique moments when the United States controls everything. And, I think what happened in 1945 at the end of the Second World War, it was that the United States was in a uniquely strong position. So it was something like half of world manufacturing in 1945, and in particular goods, in machine tools. Um, there were only three countries before 1945 that had been big machine tool producers: Germany, Japan, and the United States. Britain wasn't good at that. France wasn't good at that. You couldn't do that in China. You couldn't do that in India. And Germany and Japan were defeated. And so the United States was for a moment in a position of unique dominance. But that's a world that it was bound not to last, and it was also bound to produce resentments when the United States sees already in the 1950s. They're worried about the rise of Germany. They're worried about the resurgence of Japan in the 1960s and more in the 70s and even more in the 1980s. And so, the worry about the United States losing its position has I think, had a long history. And, I think it would also be uh, unwise to think that China could be in a position where it could take on that position of the United States in the mid 20th century. No, I mean, there are just so many other powers. And, we do like to talk about the global South sometimes, but there are very, very big differences of view, of interpretation. Um, Mexico isn't always aligned with Brazil. India and China have big historic differences. So, there's a pluralistic world out there. And I think that world of pluralism, multipolarity, or polycentrism is a good way of describing what the world order is likely to be.
Uh, I really learn a lot from your views on the world. But for China side, we Chinese scholars are very care about the American scholars' view
Yeah.
on China's development. So let's continually to focus on China.
Yeah.
I don't know because I don't know whether you have been to China before.
Yes, 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 I have.
Okay, many times. Where is the last time that you have
I
been?
haven't been since the pandemic.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
I
Maybe
was actually planning to go in March 2020, but obviously I couldn't go.
okay, but if
But I was in
possible,
Shanghai shortly before the pandemic.
okay. If possible, I'd like to invite you in the future.
Yeah,
And
I'd love to do that.
thank you. And because my question is about the China development in the past half a century. Because half a century ago, as you may know, China was still a poorest country in the world. But however, in 1978, as you know, China implemented the policy of reform and opening up.
Yeah.
And the past 46 years, reform and opening up have completely changed China. And so my question is this also a kind of crash or uh, something like the crash of traditional system and also a positive reshaping of the future system? And so my question is, as mentioned, we mentioned earlier, because there seems to be in American, I mean, in U.S. Academy community, there seems to be no enough academy perspective understanding China's future. I don't know whether it is right. So my question is, how do you evaluate China's development over the past 40 plus years based on the reform and opening up policy? And what are your expectations for China in the future? And what strategies should China adopt to address the challenges and opportunities that the Trump 2.0 era may bring?
First of all, yes, it's been an enormous success, and it really, I think, is one of the clearest demonstrations of the benefits of opening up and of economic liberalization. Um, so, I remember a few years ago, also just before the pandemic, I was in Germany, um, at a little city in southern Germany called Fürth, where two people were born. It's a very, very small town, but two people who played a big role in the 20th century. were born there. One was Ludwig Erhard, the uh, pioneer who really opened up the German economy after the Second World War. So he was, as it were, the German opposite number to Deng Xiaoping. Um, and the other was Henry Kissinger. There was this event then that was planned, and it was a celebration of the um, opening up of the house of Ludwig Erhard, and the Chinese ambassador was there. And it was a fascinating discussion that we had because we thought about these German figures that had influenced world politics. On the one hand, Karl Marx, and on the other hand, Ludwig Erhard. And they seem to stand for different things. That Marx is, obviously a theory of historical development, but also a theory of the way in which the historical development can be controlled. And Erhard is about private initiative. And it seems to me that any country has to have some kind of good relationship between the two of these, that you've got to have, on the one hand, an overall view of where you're going, and that's what the political process needs to do. And on the other hand, you need
Mm,
um, to have a substantial empowerment of private people who can unleash new developments and new techniques, and that seems to me to be the story of the future.
mm,
So um, you're at a transition moment because like Germany with the big export surpluses or Japan with the big export surpluses, in a world where other people are worried about globalization, Japan, Germany, now China with the big export surpluses. But I think, you will see a similar reaction to South Korea. You may see a similar reaction to Vietnam even. Um, the United States, as it is at the moment, is likely to be suspicious of those countries. And so, I think the secret there is, in every case, to go for a more balanced development and in the end, to make yourself less dependent on manufactured exports
mm.
and develop more the service economy and develop also more the things that I think we talked about a little bit before, the unique things that the AI revolution can give you.
My last question is about your last chapter of your new book. Because the last chapter you mentioned about the next large scale globalization.
Yeah,
Because in my opinion, such a globalization may still face a significant crisis and uncertainty. And those crises and the uncertainty do not only come from the Donald Trump or the other economic elements, but also from non-traditional security issues such as climate change,
yeah,
climate crisis, and virus you mentioned. And so, therefore, we are very concerned about the coming cooperation possibility between China and the United States. Donald Trump also said that China-US cooperation can solve all problems in the world. So my final question to you, Professor James, do you think there are any other areas of cooperation between China and the United States for the future? And how do you think about the possibility for the two big power to prevent from the next crash?
yeah. That's absolutely right. I mean, there are possibilities. Um, and I think you're right in suggesting that there's even a necessity of that kind of collaboration, because if you think of something like climate change, if you think of something like the development of possible new contagious diseases, it, even if you think of the way of dealing with old chronic diseases, um, all of those can benefit from cooperation. And with climate change, um, without cooperation, it's not going to take place. But having said that, this is why the present is so full of conflict and so problematical, and why we're having this difficult discussion now. Because if you think about it, with the technology to deal with climate change, the solar panels to get solar energy, the wind turbines, the electric battery vehicles, e-vehicles. Um, China's got an immense technical advantage in many of these areas now. And so the technology to make a green revolution is primarily coming from China. And you can see that, I think, in many, many emerging market countries, if you all over Africa, South America, it's spectacular in Pakistan. Pakistan is full of solar panels, of Chinese solar panels, and that's good. That's exactly the right kind of approach. But this is where the Europeans and the United States get worried because they think of their industries and their jobs being lost. And so, in some ways, the people in Europe who are trying to hold out against Chinese e-vehicles are also impeding the progress
Mm.
against climate change. They're not recognizing the critical role also that if you think of China as a source of critical minerals, of germanium, gallium, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development had a spectacular report in which they suggested how much the green transition was dependent on those products. Without collaboration, we're not going to be able to deal with climate change. And some aspects of the current move in the United States to push more carbon energy, I think is some aspects are worrying from that particular perspective.
Mm. Thank you so much, Professor James. I really appreciate your viewpoint and I learned a lot from your thinking. And also, I think if possible, next year I will send you email to invite you to China. Maybe if possible, look forward to seeing you in person and
Look, I
dialogue.
would love to do that. I would love to continue with this discussion. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor
Well, thank
James.
you. Thank you.
Okay, see you then.